All right, we are live. Thank you to everyone who has found their way over here from the Twitter spaces. We were having some technical difficulties, so we're over here at Bad Faith only as a sorry, I had my window open in the background. Amateur move there. So only as a kind of stopgap measure to figure out how to get this really important conversation back on track. So it really is my pleasure to be joined by Mouin Rabbani and Norman Finkelstein, who I think each have been some of the leading, most important voices as we have been struggling with covering and understanding the developing conflict in Gaza, especially after the tragedy of this past Memorial Day weekend massacre, the subsequent bombing, and new reporting about the extent to which Israeli intelligence has been working behind the scenes for years and years before October 7th to prevent the ICC from actually bringing forward any criminal charges, including the warrants that are now in the works for both Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. So I welcome you both to have a conversation both about the status of the ICC case and also the ICJ and provisional measures, which perhaps precipitated, I think, in all likelihood, precipitated some of the escalation we've seen from Israel over the last few days. I am seeing some people trying to enter the chat. I'm going to deal with that, but I'm going to open up the floor to you both while I deal with some of these technical issues. Norm, how about we start with you? You have some really particularized expertise, specifically when it comes to understanding the long trajectory of efforts to undermine the ICC in its efforts to have some accountability for Israel. So why don't you start by letting us know what this new reporting from The Guardian is all about?
Okay, I don't want to sound pedantic. On the other hand, there's every reason to understand that there's going to be a lot of confusion in our conversation this evening. So at certain points, I'm going to just pause and try to give the lay of the land before I go into the details. There are two legal bodies that we're dealing with. One is called the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The chief prosecutor currently is a person named Karim Khan from the UK. And there's a second body called the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And by common agreement, the ICJ, which is an arm of the United Nations, it's the supreme legal body in the world. So the ICC, the International Criminal Court, states join on their own volition. So the United States is currently not a member of the ICC. The state of Israel is currently not a member of the ICC, whereas Palestine, which is very much what you might call an incipient state, is formally accepted as a state in the ICC. The ICJ, every member of the United Nations is expected to defer to its either advisory opinions or its decisions in what are called contentious cases. So, henceforth, speaking, if I may, for Mouin and for yourself, we're going to use the abbreviation ICC and ICJ, but at certain points, I think all of us should respect the audience and just recall that we're talking about the International Criminal Court, not that, because otherwise it causes infinite confusion. Having said that, the ICC is a relatively new international body, and one has to say its record has not been very impressive. It has focused mostly on African states, which is why it eventually came to be called, especially among African states and Arab states, it came to be called the International Caucasian Court, not the International Criminal Court, and with good reason. So, with that in mind, let's look at what is its record on Israel and Palestine? And one, I think, has to fairly say the record has been dismal. There have been for decades now, literally decades, attempts by various parties to get some action by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, regarding Israeli conduct in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that the ICC has a huge, a voluminous record on the subject on paper, but it's never gotten to the point of actual prosecution of criminal conduct by Israel and it said Hamas. So, what's the background for the current story that came out in The Guardian? The second chief prosecutor of the ICC is a woman named Fatou Bensouda, Bensouda, and she hails from the Gambia. As a jurist in the Gambia, she had accumulated quite a large number of skeletons in her closet already. But she was named the chief prosecutor. I would not say her predecessor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, had a better record than she did, but we'll leave that aside. When Fatou Bensouda became the chief prosecutor, the main case having to do with Israel-Palestine was the case of what was called the Mavi Marmara. The Mavi Marmara was the flagship of a flotilla which was trying to bring 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid to Gaza in 2010, to be precise, May 30th, 2010. And as the flotilla was en route to Gaza, it came under attack by Israeli commandos.
In international waters.
In international waters. And as a result of the attack, 9 and then a 10th person was died. 9 people were killed on the spot and the 10th died. And there was a lot of violence attending the killings. And that became the case before Fatou Bensouda. And it was a very interesting dynamic. Bensouda was doing everything she could to suppress the case, But inside the ICC, there were principled forces who were saying, not so fast. There's a legitimate issue here. And she was trying to kill the case. And it was clear to me, I followed the case in great detail because I had followed the whole Mavi Marmara incident in great detail. In my book on Gaza, I devote 2 very large chapters to what happened because there were so many reports issued on it. And so I went through it in detail. And it was clear to me that some kind of external pressure was being applied on Chief Prosecutor Bensouda because she was fighting so tenaciously to kill this case. Believe it or not, she declared the case closed. I know it's very hard to believe. She declared the case closed 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and each time, as that old camp song goes, the cat came back. It wouldn't go away. The folks on the inside the ICC, the folks inside the ICC said, no, we're not letting it go. Well, that was pending. That was one case, the Mavi Marmara. And then there was the second case where the state of Palestine tried to bring a case against Israel based on its breaches of international law. The 2 main breaches that case focused on were the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories and the blockade of Gaza. though it also mentioned the periodic Israeli mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And that case went through a very long period of basically three aspects. I'll just go through them quickly and I'm going to turn it over to Mouin. The first issue was the ICC is state based. You know, individuals cannot bring cases before the ICC, only states can. And the issue became, is Palestine a state that qualifies to bring a case? So there was a huge issue over whether the court had jurisdiction over the case. Then there was a second issue. What is Palestine? Namely, what are its borders? Because if you're going to prosecute Israelis for crimes in Palestine, where is the Palestine? What are its borders? What defines the territorial jurisdiction of the case? And then there was a third, more technical question, whether or not the Palestinians had the right to turn over jurisdiction, in this case, to the ICC, whether it could transfer jurisdiction. And at this point, I know Mouin knows the further details. So just to say in conclusion, we have the Mavi Marmara case, which, believe it or not, is still ongoing. And then we have the case put forth by the state of Palestine regarding Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And they, where I'm leaving off, the issue was whether the ICC had jurisdiction in this case. And now, Mouin.
Thank you. I'll just make a few introductory comments that I think are interesting in this respect, and that is that Palestine first attempted to become a member of the Assembly of State Parties of the International Criminal Court. In other words, a member of the court in 2009, and that application was rejected because Palestine did not have a status, international status, that would allow it to join. Then in 2011, 2012, the status of Palestine was upgraded at the United Nations, and that gave it the right to make a second application to the ICC. Now, what happened is that neither Israel nor the United States have ratified the Rome Statute, which is a treaty that governs the operations and defines the crimes under the jurisdiction of the ICC. Neither of them are members of the ICC, and both of them placed enormous pressure on the Palestinian Authority, along with a lot of European member states of the ICC, I should add, collectively placed enormous pressure on the Palestinian Authority to refrain from making a second successful application to join the court. Now, what happened is, particularly after Israel's 2014 attack on the Gaza Strip, which was called Operation Protective Edge, the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas came under sustained pressure from Palestinians, from within his own society, from Palestinian human rights organizations, from Palestinian civil society, from Palestinian political movements, demanding that that Palestine apply once again to join the ICC so that Israel could be held accountable. Why was this important? Because the ICC does not have any jurisdiction over Israelis, because Israel is not a member. But if Palestine becomes a member, then the ICC has jurisdiction over any crime committed by anyone on the territory of Palestine, and on any crime committed by a Palestinian national anywhere in the world. So Abbas has then put a condition for a Palestinian application to the ICC. He demanded that that he demanded that the leadership of every Palestinian political movement explicitly support the application to join the ICC. That included the leadership of Hamas. It's unclear why Abbas did this. My suspicion is that he hoped that Hamas, fearing its own leaders would be indicted by the ICC, would not give him this support. Or the alternative explanation is that he didn't want to subsequently be held responsible should any Palestinians be indicted by the ICC. Be that as it may, Abbas did get a explicit written support for the Palestinian application to the ICC from the leadership of Hamas. And so, ironically, it is because of Hamas's approval of this case against the opposition of Israel, of the United States, of the Europeans. That's why we are where we are now. If it had been up to Israel or the US or the EU, there would be no investigation of war crimes and crimes against humanity here. So that's the first part of the background. The second part of the background is that when Palestine's second application to the ICC succeeded in 2015, it was also agreed that the investigation would commence with effect from June 2014. So formally, at least, the court has been investigating all crimes under the Rome Statute in Palestine or by Palestinians since 2014. And one thing that I found interesting about the recent indictments is that they all concern alleged crimes that took place after October 7th, 2023. So, in other words, Israel's settlement policy in the West Bank, which is a war crime under the Rome Statute, Israel's practice of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute, Israel's sustained attacks on the Great March of Return in 2018, Israel's Operation Protective Edge, all these major issues which the ICC has allegedly been investigating since at least 2021 do not figure at all in the recent indictments. And I think it was a political decision by the court's prosecutor, Karim Khan, to begin the case. You know, history starts on October 7th. And in that context, he indicted more Palestinians than Israelis, three Palestinians and two Israelis. He's obviously playing politics. If I could just make one last point about how we got to this point that we are at now. When Karim Khan first succeeded Fatou Bensouda, he made a presentation, one of his regular updates of the UN Security Council about the status of the cases in his docket. In this case, I think it was about Libya. And during that presentation, he repeatedly made very clear that he would only pursue, or that he would prioritize only those cases that had been referred to him, to his office, by the Security Council itself. There are three ways in which an ICC investigation can commence: referral by the Security Council, at the request of a member state, or at the initiative of the prosecutor, at the initiative of the Office of the Prosecutor, provided a panel of judges approves such an investigation. But Khan basically said, I'm only going to prioritize those that are referred to me by the Security Council. And what he meant, the signal he was giving, was that he would basically put the ongoing investigations into Afghanistan and into Palestine in a drawer to collect dust, and in doing so, please the Americans, the Europeans, and the Israelis. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, and almost as soon as the first Russian soldier set foot on Ukrainian soil, he opened an investigation. And in the space of less than a year, issued arrest warrants for the head of state of a permanent member of the Security Council, Vladimir Putin. So, with every passing day of Israel's genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip, the hypocrisy of not doing anything on the situation in Palestine while having moved so rapidly on another investigation that was not referred by the Security Council became too much to bear. The second factor, I think, is the huge outcry from global public opinion against the ICC prosecutors' inertia. And lastly, and I think Norm has spoken about this previously, is that the prosecutor's own peers, luminaries in the field of international law, began to publicly criticize him for doing nothing. So, as the recent Guardian Plus 972 investigation of the Mossad pressure tactics, to put it mildly, on the ICC make clear, there was enormous pressure on him to do nothing. He was inclined to do nothing. But it's an object lesson in how politics work that the countervailing pressure on him to do something was ultimately greater than the pressure to do nothing. And that's why we are where we are today.
Yeah, I alluded to this on Rising today, I think in the context of doing my radar, that it really does feel like the shift that I alluded to, the shift in public opinion, when you're seeing people like Piers Morgan suddenly flip on Israel after having been such a staunch defender of its right to basically have carte blanche for the purpose of self-defense over the last 7 months, it does seem really accurate to say that Israel has managed to undo layers and layers of the mechanisms that have been protecting it and guarding it against any accountability for decades and generations by being so openly beyond the pale, so flagrant in its violations since October 7th. There was a very sophisticated system of safeguards that you've just described. The fact that Palestine had to lobby to even be considered a state with over which the ICC would have jurisdiction in the first place. A kind of perverse posture for it to be in the first place, by the way, given that America and keeps voting over and over again to preclude it from being able to be recognized by the UN in the first instance. Okay, so now you have Israel that's choosing not to be a signatory of the Rome Statute, America that's choosing not to be, again, as a method to avoid accountability, and then Palestine who's banging to get in because it wants somebody in the international community to hold Israel accountable. But even that decision is left up to the very people who are subject to so much influence from Israel. Okay, then you get in and you still are faced with this rank hypocrisy of the heel dragging and the choice not to bring these charges. And then what you describe, I want to make this point clear as well, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine suddenly opens everything up because, one point we haven't mentioned is that neither Russia nor Ukraine were signatories of the Rome Statute either. And yet we had a very different tone coming from both the ICC and the Biden administration with respect to how it felt about the ICC's choice to issue arrest warrants for Putin and the U.S. then also collaborated with, supported the ICC in its investigation by providing evidence of Russian war crimes.
ICC good, ICC bad.
Right. Okay, so now let's maybe just get to what is happening right now. We have this explosive story from Plus 972 and from The Guardian about the pretty explicit nature of the behind the scenes coercion, not just the kind of the political pressure that you've just both walked us through, but the active attempt to intimidate the former ICC prosecutor out of ever bringing these charges. Again, charges that predate October 7th by years and years. Which of you wants to take on current events?
I'll just give a little background, and then Mouin can fill in background where in areas you clearly know more than me. I studied it from one angle, you clearly know it from another angle, the Palestinian angle, which I've never looked at. And then let Mouin also bring up the present. I think you make an important point, and I'm very happy I asked you to be here because I think you just give clarity to the discrete levels of what goes on. There's a tendency to lump it all in one mishmash of corruption, but
Mm-hmm.
it's levels of corruption. There's the corruption of moral cowardice. There's the corruption of careerism. But there's another element. There's an element of blackmail. And really, as I put it in my book on Fatou Bensouda, the sordid and squalid, I put it, the sordid and squalid weapons in Israel's arsenal. And there, I think we have to look at issues of blackmail and also of money. I know you're not supposed to talk about money, that's called economic reductionism. But I remember Alexander Coburn, a radical journalist who you may not know, he once said, I think crude Marxism is a good place to begin. Uh, you follow the money. So I'm going to just go one step, a couple of steps before Fatou Bensouda. And here Mouin can also fill in, so I hope you'll make a mental note to fill in. If you look at the human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, for a very long time, they walked on eggshells with Israel for a very simple reason. They were terrified their donors were going to withdraw the money because it was typically liberal Jewish donors who financed the human rights organizations. And it was only with the first Intifada in 1987 to 1993 that the human rights organizations began to take a firmer stand when it came to Israel. Now, Amnesty International actually came on board pretty well until Operation Protective Edge. Human Rights Watch, it was a real battle. It's a very funny thing to watch now. I've had conversations with Mouin about it. To watch Ken Roth go after Israel. That's not the same Ken Roth who was the head of Human Rights Watch. It's a very different Ken Roth. When he was at Human Rights Watch, it was said, and I think accurately, that of all the reports HRW put out, and they were a large number, a voluminous number of reports from around the world, the only reports Ken Roth went over with his red pen were the ones on Israel and Palestine. And the thing about these human rights reports is they have two aspects. One is the factual aspect. And in general, the human rights organizations are very accurate, not always perfectly accurate, but very accurate on the facts. But then there's a second level, legally interpreting the facts. Is this a disproportionate attack? Is this an indiscriminate attack? Is this a direct attack, a purposeful attack? And there's a lot of wiggle room. And it was very clear that Human Rights Watch was bending over backwards when it came to the legal issues of giving Israel more than the benefit of a doubt. And then at one point, it broke out into the open. And I'm sure that Mouin can recall, and he has personal experience, which he may or may not want to share regarding Kenneth Roth, where there was an open rebellion. One of the leading figures in Human Rights Watch was Robert Bernstein. And Bernstein was a big figure in the human rights community, as well as being very rich. And he and another woman, I always forget her last name, Edith what? Do you remember her last name?
No.
Well, they were the big money bags in HRW. And they were enraged at the reaction of the human rights community to Operation Cast Lead, where they were very good, the human rights community. HRW put out 7 reports, and Amnesty International put out a very large report called 22 Days of Death and Destruction. Uh, Human Rights Watch put out reports titled White Flag Killings, in which it documented Palestinians, including children, holding the white flag and being shot down by Israel. Well, there was a huge internal battle which unfolded in HRW. Then Robert Bernstein quit very dramatically HRW, put out an op-ed attacking HRW.
Showing he never really gave a hoot about human rights in the first place.
Exactly. And then went after Richard Goldstone. Now, Richard Goldstone was a South African jurist of quite high stature. You could say in the same level as, say, John Dugard. He was a first-rank jurist. He was also, I don't use the term, it's his self-described term. He was a self-described Zionist, very active in Zionist causes. His daughter lived in Israel. And he was asked by the Human Rights Council to chair the mission to go see what Israel did during Operation Cast Lead.
In 2008, 2009.
And it was a very dramatic moment, because here is a Zionist and a person of high judicial stature being asked. He then was told, you can write on your own the terms of your investigation. You decide how you want to investigate, who you want to investigate, and so on and so forth. Well, he said, I can't refuse a request if they're telling me I can write the terms of the request. I can't do that. He did write the terms. He investigated. He produced a voluminous report, something on the order of 400 pages, and it was absolutely, utterly devastating to Israel. Devastating. He then came under huge attack, very personal. The rabbi in South Africa said he could not attend his grandson's bar mitzvah. Yes, it had sunk that low. And he seemed to be standing firm. He did seem to be standing firm, Richard Goldstone. And then on April 1st, 2011, it was almost as if it were an April Fool's joke. It was April 1st, 2011. There is an op-ed in the Washington Post. He recanted the report. Yes. I'll tell you, I remember that day because I invested a lot in the Goldstone report. On a personal level, we even made a video program on it, reading from sections of it. My heart was shattered. And I remember I sent an email to John Dugard, who was the senior member of the South African delegation to the ICJ in the current proceedings. He's the senior man. He's like 87 now. He wears the red robe if you watch the proceedings. And I was acquainted with John Dugard. And I said, something in me died at that moment. And he said, me too. And it was interesting. Just give me a half second. He wrote an article in the New Statesman. And Dugard is not, he's not nearly as carefree with language as I am, if you get my point. And he said about Goldstone's recantation, he wrote, there are no new facts that exonerate Israel and that could possibly have led Goldstone to change his mind. What made him change his mind therefore remains a closely guarded secret. And that's the background to the Bensouda story, namely John Dugard, who, believe me, is very respectable and as a lawyer, very cautious with his language, transmitting the fact that something sordid and squalid occurred here to cause Dugard, to cause Goldstone to recant. And then we had now, as I said, from the time I started to scrutinize the record, there's something weird going on here with Bensouda. And I wrote a book. I'm just going to hold up the title just because of the title. I accuse. There is something wrong here. Something wrong. And there I think it's money and it's blackmail. And there's a third kind, and then I have to give it over to my dear friend Mouin. There's a third kind. And then there is, I said, there's money and blackmail, there's moral cowardice, and then there's just careerism and opportunism. As you probably know, Brianna, last month in April again, April is that cruelest month. Last month in April 26th, what did the former president of the ICJ do? Joan Donoghue. She went on the BBC program Hard Talk, and she shamelessly and shamefully lied and said the ICJ never found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. A flat out lie. I've devoted already now 20 pages single space, which poor Mouin had to labor through, to documenting that this is a shameful and shameless lie. But I don't believe in her case it was blackmail. It was just, as Mouin has said, she's out of a job now. She's no longer in the ICJ. She's looking for work. And given the nature of the legal community in the United States, she had to repudiate the ICJ finding. Mouin.
Well, Brianna, I'll turn it over to you maybe for your comments, and then let me know where you would like me to pick up.
Yeah, I'll just briefly really clarify that what you're describing is an ICC, which has been, jokingly, not so hilariously, referred to as the International Caucasian Court, because it has a reputation of not pursuing countries with more status and power in the global north, but exclusively or almost exclusively bringing warrants and prosecuting cases against figures from the global south, right? And that's even before we get into the specific context of Israel. And you're also describing, both in Bensouda and as I understand it, also with Prosecutor Khan, that these were individuals that were frankly considered to be friendly to, or at least somehow either through threats or financial coercion or political coercion, more likely to align with the interests of Israel and the West than someone who, let's say, is objectively looking at the facts, or who might even be biased toward Palestine. And yet, despite all of the bias kind of militating in the direction of letting Israel off the hook, circumstances seem to have compelled both Bensouda and now Prosecutor Khan into being in a situation where you were either working on or now have brought forward warrants against Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. So I want to maybe ask you, Mouin, to get into the specifics of what this new reporting is all about and the extent of the behind the scenes, I would call it illegal coercion, that was going on against Bensouda. But I'd also like to broaden this up a little bit at a certain point to talk about the kind of situation on the ground in Gaza over the last 4 or 5 days since the weekend, and how you think the escalations we've seen from Israel relate to the kind of increasing pressure from these international organizations, who I think many people thought might never get to the point where they're so explicitly trying, at least, to hold Israel
Yes.
accountable.
Yes. Well, I'll start with the latter part first, because while I don't think it's that the recent escalation is entirely unrelated to the International Criminal Court, I think it's more closely related to recent developments at the International Court of Justice. And South Africa, as you know, in late December of last year, submitted an application to the court in which it accused Israel of violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention. The court in late January, as Norm pointed out, found that South Africa had plausibly accused Israel of genocide. It found that, these cases can take years. It found that there was a real risk of irreparable harm to the Palestinians with respect to their rights under the Genocide Convention, namely the right not to be genocided, if I can put it that way. And it found.
I wonder if you can emphasize that. Basically, if Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, and as Mouin said, it may take years to get to this case, they may all be dead.
Yes, I mean, just to
That's
get
the whole point of the provisional measures.
Yes.
They may all be dead before the case ever comes before the court.
Yes, and just to add to your point about the former president of the court, Judge Donahue, if the court had not found that the case against Israel was plausible, it would have just dismissed the case.
Exactly.
So it would have said, this is a frivolous lawsuit, so to speak. You're just trying to besmirch Israel's good name. Case closed. But no, it found that the accusation was plausible. Secondly, it found that there was real risk of irreparable harm to the rights of the Palestinians, meaning that those rights could be irreparably harmed before, let's say, the merits phase of the case was heard and concluded. And it also concluded that it needed to act with urgency to prevent that irreparable harm. And on that basis, it adopted a series of provisional measures. South Africa went back to the court on 3 occasions since then, basically saying there have been significant changes in the situation, that the situation had gotten so much worse that the court needed to adopt additional provisional measures. I believe the first time it did so was in February of this year, and the court concluded that there was no need for any further provisional measures. Then in March, the court not only reconfirmed its initial measures, but also added a number of new ones, as I recall, that mainly concerned the entry and provision of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. And in this latest instance, South Africa placed particular emphasis on the situation in Rafah. It called for a comprehensive cessation of hostilities and a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. But the real focus of its requests was an end to Israel's military offensive in Rafah. And the court, once again, with a majority of 13-2, an overwhelming majority by any standard, concluded that South Africa had convincingly had sufficiently convinced the court that the situation had changed so drastically that the existing provisional measures were no longer sufficient to address the situation. And it called on Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah and any other measures that may result in acts of genocide. I'm paraphrasing, and there's a comma in there that Israel's apologists and flunkies have sought to interpret as saying the court is basically ordering Israel to go with all the necessary means and raise Rafah to the ground. But anyway, so immediately after that resolution or that ruling, what does Israel do a day or two later? It bombs Rafah. It actually bombs a tent camp in Rafah. It bombs a tent camp in a zone that Israel itself has designated as a safe space in Rafah, and burns dozens of people alive. It literally incinerates dozens of people. Babies are beheaded, unlike the beheaded babies that Joe Biden claims to have seen pictures of that don't exist. These are real. And I think what the way we need to understand this is that Israel was sending a clear message of we're going to do what we want because we can do what we want. And the International Court of Justice can go to hell and can put its provisional rulings where the sun don't shine, so to speak. And why can we do this, Israel? Well, because Joe Biden has our back. Joe Biden, his red line about Rafah was merely for public consumption. We are openly, brazenly violating it, and nothing is going to happen. So it was basically, I think, sending a political message of we will act lawlessly, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it because because the United States will ensure that we have impunity in our actions. That is how I understood it. And Brianna, just to get back to an earlier point you made when I was explaining why Karim Khan ultimately felt compelled to issue these provisional measures, as you rightly pointed out, it was not only the pressure but also the sheer brazenness of Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip made it impossible to hide the sun with your finger anymore. And then I'll just say a few words about this story, which was actually investigation conducted by the Guardian, by Plus 972, an Israeli magazine, and another Israeli outfit called Local Call. Apparently, this investigation has been going on for a year, and they basically it paints the Israeli intelligence service as the equivalent of a crime family, really, of gangsters, who at one point in the former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda was at the United Nations in New York, meeting with the former leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Joseph Kabila. Yeah. And all of a sudden, unannounced, Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, just comes barging into the room. At another point, he basically tells her, you need to think about your personal security and the security of your family. At another point, I think a envelope full of $100 bills or something is hand delivered to her at her home. Really, I mean, mafia tactics intended to intimidate. At one point, they were trying to find dirt on her husband, and at the very least, what this helps explain is that the former prosecutor Bensouda felt so intimidated that this helped slow down the investigation. That every time she went the extra 1,000 miles to make sure that all the T's had been crossed multiple times, all the I's had been dotted many times over. That's the most charitable explanation that can be given in this case.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Guardian at one point frames it as an unsuccessful blackmail
Yes,
operation because ultimately we now have these ICC warrants, I suppose,
yes,
from her predecessor or from the man who followed her,
the
obviously.
successor, yes.
But I don't know that I would describe basically successfully delaying for years any real action on this investigation, turning it from an investigation with an end date and a conclusion to just a perpetual investigation is a failure on the part of Israeli intelligence. It seems like they, for a long time, got what they wanted and what is frequently the Israeli game, which is simply to delay the investigation, delay accountability, and to a point at which no one's really paying attention. If you do eventually admit, oh gosh, I guess we did shoot, for example, Abu Akla, like eventually we do admit that we did one of these crimes. Now years have passed and the outrage cycle
Yeah.
has gone.
Well, if I could just make one more point, Norm, before I think I both agree and disagree. I agree in the sense that yes, they managed to postpone many of these milestones by years, but ultimately they failed to prevent those milestones from being reached, which I think is not insignificant, given that I think that was also an objective of theirs. And I would be interested to learn how their mafia tactics produce so much resentment. So, Norm, you were talking about the ICC staff in rebellion against repeatedly bringing up the Mavi Marmara case again. I wonder to what extent these mafia tactics were actually at some level counterproductive. It's purely speculative. The other point I want to make is that this investigation that we're talking about demonstrated not only that these gangster tactics were used against the ICC, its prosecutor, its staff, I presume its judges as well, but they were also used against Palestinians, against Palestinian human rights organizations that were supplying information to the ICC, against Palestinian victims of Israeli war crimes who were giving accounts of what they had endured to Palestinian human rights organizations who were then forwarding them to the ICC. So this was kind of mob boss on a transcontinental scale. And in fact, there's one case of and ultimately, several of these organizations were designated as terrorist organizations by the US's latest hero, Benny Gantz, who was defense minister at the time, precisely in order to discredit them. And I wanted to make one other point, but it escapes me for the moment. So I'll stop there.
Before I come back to you, Norm, just while we're in the thick of the facts of what the Guardian and Plus 972 have reported, I just wanted to read a couple of short segments from the Guardian article, just to really put a fine point on the nature of this intimidation, because this is such a wild story. I don't want us kind of putting it in greater context to obscure how wild it is, how the level of impunity with which Israel is able to act. So when you reference the fact that there was this intimidation where this Mossad agent showed up at, I believe it was a conference, and saw her directly, he also was able to get her phone number. This is directly from the Guardian piece under a section titled Threats and Manipulation. Quote, after the surprise meeting with Kabila and Bensouda in New York, Cohen, the Mossad agent, repeatedly phoned the chief prosecutor and sought meetings with her. 3 sources were called. According to 2 people familiar with the situation, at one stage, Bensouda asked Cohen how he had obtained her phone number, to which he replied, "Did you forget what I do for a living?" According to accounts shared with ICC officials, he's alleged to have told her, quote, "You should help us and let us take care of you. You don't want to be getting into things that could compromise your security or that of your family."
Yep.
One individual briefed on Cohen's activities said he had used, quote, "despicable tactics" against Bensouda as part of an ultimately unsuccessful effort to intimidate an influencer. They likened his behavior to stalking. The Mossad had also taken a keen interest in Bensouda's family members and obtained transcripts of secret recordings of her husband. According to two sources with direct knowledge of the situation, Israeli officials then attempted to use the material to discredit the prosecutor. This is not kind of a vague, soft intimidation. This really is
Yes.
mafia stuff, and importantly, went to the top.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just remembered the point I'd forgotten, which is that the ICC operates on the basis of complementarity, meaning that if national courts properly investigate and prosecute these serious violations of the Rome Statute, then the ICC itself will not do so. So one objective of this whole Mossad operation was to find out which particular crimes were being communicated to the ICC, and then basically opening fake investigations of these crimes, and then trying to convince the ICC that, what are you on about? We're already dealing with these files. So that's the extremes to which this mafia organization known as the Mossad went.
And can I ask you just about that point also? I mean, because there's this news story out today in Haaretz about 7 Israeli cops that are expected to be tried for stamping the Star of David on a Palestinian's face last August. And I noticed this coming out in some of the press briefings as well. Yesterday, one reporter asked, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Kirby or Matt Miller, but asked, well, and what we're looking for accountability here. You're saying you're watching this. You're saying you're in conversations with Israel. You're saying Israel's investigating itself. But we've seen a pattern of behavior where those investigations either don't go anywhere, Israel exonerates itself, or it gives the perpetrators a slap on the wrist. Can you give us an example of where there's actually been accountability? I think it was Miller. Miller brought up one example of an IDF officer who had been doing Jewish prayers in a mosque, trying to be disrespectful, and that person had been reassigned. And I think the point is, obviously, we're talking about a mass murder and starvation campaign, and you're pointing to an example of someone who had done something relatively de minimis and gotten basically a slap on the wrist for it. Harley, that's a great example of how there is complementarity in Israel, where they can be a democratic society who holds themselves accountable. My skeptical brain, my cynical brain is now looking at how high profile this story is getting pushed around about, Israeli cops who did a bad crime in branding someone, branding a Palestinian person with a Star of David. Sure enough, I hope there is accountability. But, am I being overly cynical by saying now they're pushing these kind of stories to the front to try to lay the foundation for the idea that, oh, yes.
No, you're not being overly cynical, because the Rafah attack, which we're discussing, it was none other than the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who immediately announced an investigation. Of course, we know this is a complete sham, but it also shows that these indictments and these cases, what Israeli commentators have referred to as a diplomatic and legal tsunami, is beginning to have an impact.
If I can, just there's so many issues here, and I'm not sure where to begin. I'll just begin with the last one and then try to go backwards. There are investigations after every Israeli massacre, and we know exactly what the results are. Operation Protective Edge. The worst punishment was one soldier got 7.5 months in jail. Now remember, in Operation Protective Edge, 1,400 people were killed, 1,200 of whom were civilians, 350 children were killed, 6,300 homes were killed. And what was the punishment? One soldier got 7.5 months in jail for stealing a credit card. That's a fact.
Wow.
That was the worst punishment. One soldier, 7.5 months in jail. I don't know if he ever served time. That's what he was, that was.
Was he allowed to keep the credit card?
And then Mavi Marmara, 10 people murdered by the Israeli Special Forces. What was the punishment? One person stole $600. and he got punished for stealing $600. That was it. So the record is long and very clear on these investigations and their consequences. Now, I'd like to just go back, well, three things. Number one, I assumed at the time with Goldstone, Mouin was already a close friend of mine at the time. My assumption was they didn't blackmail him, but they probably got something on his wife, excuse me, his daughter. His daughter lived in Israel. Maybe she had an affair. Maybe her husband had an affair. And you could just imagine the scene of sure, Daddy, please, please take back the report, because it's going to destroy my marriage, destroy our family. That's an easily imaginable. I remember I discussed it with Professor Chomsky at the time, and when I gave him my own speculations, he began to publicly say that you really couldn't fault morally, you couldn't fault Goldstone. Because when you come under those personal family pressures, well, what would most people do? He's, protect his daughter, protect his grandchild. So at some level, I was willing to give Goldstone a pass. I was not willing to give Joan Donahue a pass, the former former ICJ president, because I think it was complete careerism and opportunism. There was no blackmail going on, in my opinion. Now, on the whole question of accountability, what Bensouda did is what typically happens, namely, she killed the Mavi Marmara case, or attempted to kill it. She's now in her last months in office, and she doesn't want to go out with a cloud over her head for having been basically a tool for the U.S. So she begins a new investigation, the one pertaining to Israeli crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. And then she concludes, you know what she concludes? We have jurisdiction. The court has jurisdiction. Palestine is a state. We have jurisdiction. But then, you know what she then does?
What's
She
that?
says, well, I'm not certain we have jurisdiction, so I'm going to let what's called a pretrial chamber decide whether I was correct in my finding. And so she kicked the can down the road. And by the time the court decided that Bensouda correctly concluded the ICC had jurisdiction, she was gone. And that's a very typical pattern. If you take the case of Barack Obama, he was the most pro-Israel president in American history. In fact, he and Samantha Power bragged that they blocked, unlike any previous administration, they either blocked or vetoed every single resolution in the Security Council. Never had that been done. That was unprecedented. And then, as you know, he signed the $30 billion military deal for Israel over 10 years. However, Obama, all he cares about is his image, his legacy. And he knew that wouldn't look terrific in his memoir. So what did he do? In November 2016, 1 month before he's leaving office, he finally abstains on the Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlements. First resolution. Why did he do it? Pure narcissism. So he put in his volume 2 of his interminable memoir that he was balanced. He was balanced. He didn't give Israel a green light all the time. He was balanced, and he didn't veto that last resolution in November 2016. Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the Security Council, before Gutierrez, has actually been quite excellent. Before Gutierrez, Ban Ki-moon gave Israel a green light and everything until his last month in office. He condemned Israel. So Bensouda was following the pattern of waiting till it's too late to do anything to finally do something. Now, I'm very sorry Mouin has left, because I did want to not disagree with him so much as kind of nuance, and I hate the word nuance, but kind of nuance what he said about the ineffectiveness of all of the attempts to rein in Israel. So, if you allow me, on a slightly but not too technical note, the ICJ, in its last provisional order, said the military operation, excuse me, the military offensive must cease immediately. But then, as Mouin alluded to, and as you, I think, mentioned, there were all these commas in that sentence, which then began to be exploited by Israel to say, actually, it didn't call for a total halt to the military offensive. It only called for a halt to the extent that it doesn't cause mass killings. Now,
What can you walk us through? Maybe I can pull up the sentence. What is the argument about the commas exactly?
okay, I'm going to walk it through. If you want to put it up on the screen, I can walk it
Okay.
through with you because unfortunately I've had to walk it through my head about 10,000 times since this thing was issued. So if you want to first put it up on the screen, and then I will happily walk it through with you.
Okay.
It's, I think,
Here it is.
paragraph 50, if my memory is right.
Well, I have the Guardian wrote a piece up about it, so I'm just going to um, pull that up. Oh, here we go.
Hi.
Glad to have you back.
Marie, I'm
Sorry,
so happy you didn't,
internet went down.
because I want to have a slight disagreement with you, but I want to hear your input.
Okay.
So, as Brianna is looking for the famous sentence with the famous comma, uh, and the huge investment has now been put into interpreting that comma, um, I wanted to say uh, this is not good because we need the exact wording. Uh, if you put up ICJ, if you just, I have it in front of me. I have it. Uh,
Yes, it's there in the lower paragraph that begins the interpretation, the last three lines.
okay. Requires
Oh,
Israel.
sorry, no, that's quoting Barak. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, let's see. I think it's okay, 1 second. This is okay. Uh, I have it, but I won't be able to put it on the screen because I don't know how you do that. Obviously.
You want to
Um,
just read it out?
yes,
Yeah,
just.
it's not this part here. The ruling, sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. The
Mhm.
ruling passed by 13 votes to 2 said Israel should, quote, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate, comma, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Okay. So, Brianna, with all due respect and regard for your reading skills, you read it a little bit too quickly. So I don't think the audience, your listeners, will be able to grasp it. So if you don't mind, just repeat that one more time, and then I want to just parse it and explain my understanding of it.
Sure. The ruling passed by 13 votes to 2 said Israel should, quote, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Okay. So Mouin, I'm going to have a slight difference of opinion with you on the consequences of the court's ruling. First of all, let me address the text itself. You have to bear in mind the court only has Brianna Yorgan. I hate to talk into cyberspace. Uh, should we just wait for Brianna to come back, or okay?
No,
Here she
just
is.
go ahead and talk amongst yourself. I'm just going to close my window so flies don't come in really quickly. Sorry.
So you have to remember, the case is brought before the court on the basis of the Genocide Convention, and therefore the court can only make rulings based on the threat, the risk of genocide. So the first part of the sentence says Israel must cease its military offensive immediately, and other acts it's committing in Rafah, which might have, that's the purpose of the comma. The last phrase is, which might have genocidal consequences, because they can only rule on the question of the risk of genocide. So here is what I'm going to explain, and then allow me to differ into some degree with Mouin, my old friend and comrade. The court is presented with a dilemma. Dilemma has three prongs. Number one, nobody disputes that after October 7th, Israel had some kind of right of self-defense. What it takes, what form it takes, there's disagreement. But it was not tenable legally or practically in the face of the fact that Hamas was still firing rockets at Israel, or projectiles at Israel, and was still holding hostages. It was not tenable legally or politically for the court to determine that Israel had no right whatsoever of self-defense. That was not a tenable position. Number two, the court has no jurisdiction over Hamas, and therefore whatever measure it took would be unilaterally applied. Let's say the court calls for a ceasefire. Legally, that only applies to Israel, because Hamas is not party to the case. And that too,
or the convention,
or the convention, the Genocide Convention. So that too was not tenable legally or practically. And now there's a third problem, which, Brianna, as a lawyer, you understand. Namely, the court wanted overwhelming majorities. It's a very powerful statement to be able to say 15-2, 13-2. Once it starts being muddled, that vote, it's much easier to dismiss. Now, it was very clear from the separate opinions in this hearing by Nolte, the German judge, by Antonescu, the Romanian judge, and even to some extent Taladi, the South African judge, that they were insistent that you had to retain the Israeli right of self-defense. So what happens? It happens in every court. It happens in our Supreme Court. They try to find a wording that will satisfy all 13 judges, so we can get that 13-2 again, like we had 15-2. For reasons not worth going into, it's now down to 13-2. So it was those three considerations: the right of self-defense, the fact that Hamas wasn't party to the proceedings or joined the Genocide Convention, and the practical consideration, which anybody who studies Supreme Court law knows, namely, the justices are trying constantly to juggle the language to get a consensus or a majority in the case of our Supreme Court. So it is correct, in my opinion, that the court did not call unequivocally for an immediate ceasefire, and that the offensive had to put at risk the Palestinian rights under the Genocide Convention, which those rights are summarized right after the comma. You can't launch a military attack which will cause destruction of a or significant damage to a people. Okay, that's my understanding, having I believe carefully studied the matter. Now it's the question of the consequence. Maybe Comrade Mouin was being a little bit, let's just say, hasty in saying it has no consequence. I cannot agree with that, because it's in effect saying all the work and the sacrifice of the student protests, all the demonstrations around the world, the heroic, courageous, tenacious, principled position of South Africa. It's as if to say it all went to naught so long as Biden has Israel's back. This is all a
Sorry,
meaningless.
Norm, I have to very briefly interrupt you. That wasn't my point of view. I was expressing what I understood to be Israel's.
I misunderstood that.
Yeah.
My belief is that the reaction hasn't been what we would want. It's not what we desire. And it's certainly very, very far from what's just. But I do believe that the ICJ order, the cautious language of Biden, the attacks that the Biden administration are coming under, the audaciousness in a positive way, as Reverend, what's his name? Barack's Reverend Wright.
Jeremiah Wright, yeah.
Jeremiah Wright, the audaciousness of hope, the audacity of hope, the fact that more and more people are speaking up, it does put pressure.
Yeah, I agree.
And it has had consequence. Has it saved as many lives as we would wish? No. But has it saved lives? I answer emphatically, yes, yes, yes. And now is not the time to despair. Now is the time to turn up the heat and go more and more aggressively, because they're finding it more and more difficult to defend this real life, on real time genocide that's being committed by Israel. So my message is, it's not enough, but don't despair. I believe we are winning. I do believe that, because Mouin and I go back far enough, and I go way back before Mouin. We go back far enough to remember that things like those student protests for Palestine, the sacrifice, losing your graduation, suspension, expulsion for the cause of Palestine, the fact that South Africa keeps coming back and coming back and coming back and coming back. They will not relent. It's unbelievable. If you read each of their submissions has like 100 or 200 footnotes. Each submission. It is so impressive to see John Dugard, 87 years old, and he's wobbling up to the lectern to give his presentation. It's not easy at his age to keep coming back to the Hague. It's so amidst the horror of what many UN agencies have said now. They said we've run out of words. We've run out. We've used catastrophe. We've used disaster. We've used unprecedented. We've used, and they said we've run out of words to describe what's been done to Gaza, the people of Gaza, the landscape of Gaza. To see the fight back, the tenacity, I think with the ICJ, given the limits, what they did was wonderful, wonderful. And if you noticed, right after when Israel carried out its latest massacre, every world leader, the Chinese, the German, the French, they all said violation of international law. They were leaning on the ICJ provisional order. They all leaned on it. So progress, very slow. And every life that's lost is irrevocably lost. But I do not believe we should despair at this point.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Let me ask you this, perhaps somewhat provocatively. I mean, what we've just described is a scenario in which parties that are very reluctant to move in the direction of advocacy for Palestine have been pushed to do so because of the flagrant crimes of Israel. But it has not been enough to push the United States into a position where it no longer provides political cover and literal ammunition for Israel to continue to pursue its agenda in Gaza. And I want you each to give your best understanding for what is causing Biden to humiliate himself on the public stage, to send his surrogates out to humiliate themselves in front of the press, trying to do bizarre dances to justify why the red line is now a yellow goalpost that keeps moving all over the place. Why is it? What is Biden's incentive to basically set himself up to lose an election in no small part because of his unwillingness to do what now the international community has finally come around to doing, which is to say Israel has finally gone too far? Mouin?
Yeah, I unfortunately need to go.
Okay.
But I'll answer that briefly. I thought Daniel Levy of the U.S. Middle East Project made a very good point in an interview the other day, where he said if you look at the U.S. attitude, it's only Washington that has the right to criticize Israel. No one else does, and that helps explain the hysterical campaign that they're now waging against the ICC and the ICJ and others. In other words, the right to criticize Israel about anything is a right that is exclusive to the U.S. But as you point out, that's a right they're not using. My own view is that Biden, it's an easy mistake to make these days, that Biden and a number of his senior officials, Blinken, McGurk, Sullivan, are all very deeply invested in Israel and are very deeply invested in Israel achieving its objectives, even though as they realize that these objectives are becoming increasingly unattainable. It's a commitment for which they're willing to pay a price, even if that price means losing the next election. I mean, we have our principles, they have theirs, and Israel's genocide is one of their principles, so to speak. It's an ideological commitment for which they're willing to pay a price. I think that's an important part of it, and I wouldn't minimize the other aspect of it, which is from their point of view, Palestinians are not really human beings. And I would even go so far as to say that this group has now really demonstrated that from its point of view, maybe the genocide is not such a bad thing. Sure, an Israeli military victory and destruction of Hamas would be nice, but failing that, the less Palestinians, the better.
Mouin, I'm going to beg of you. I want to make two comments on that, and then I would like us to sign off together.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll just make it for another day. Hopefully, Brianna will make herself available, and we could just have a part two when there's new events to analyze. In answer to your question, in my opinion, there are two aspects to it. There is a strategic aspect to it. Israel plays a crucial role in U.S. policy in the Middle East. And the U.S. has invested so much in what's sometimes called that stationary aircraft carrier called Israel.
Which is sinking.
Yeah, which is sinking. So October 7th was a disaster for the U.S. as well.
Yes.
Remember, countries like Saudi Arabia, they want to become part of the U.S.-Israel alliance because they're expecting military protection should there be a conflict with Iran. Well, October 7th put in doubt just how reliable that military protection might be coming from the U.S. and Israel. Israel revealed itself to be, even to myself, it revealed itself to be much weaker in areas where people would imagine it had top of the line competence, whether it's in intelligence or even, rescue operations. People forgot it took a week for them to even add up the number of people killed. It took, the number start from 50, then it went into the hundreds. And I asked a friend of mine, a mutual friend of Mouin's and I said, why couldn't they give you a number? Because all the bodies are going to either be in the morgue or they're going to be in the graveyard. And he says, well, guess what? We really weren't equipped for a massacre of that size. That's why it was so slow. So I believe Mouin put it as an ideological commitment. I would put it as a strategic commitment.
Yes, certainly.
Israel.
I would say it's both.
Yeah, I agree. It's both. And then there's a second factor, and people are very hesitant to speak to the factor, but I'm not hesitant because I think facts should be called out. There's a Jewish billionaire class, and everybody knows in the United States you can predict virtually every election. Thomas Ferguson has a career based on this. You can predict virtually every election by campaign contributions. Whichever camp gets the most contributions almost invariably wins the election. And there was and is a real fear that if Biden changes his policy on Israel and Trump has made clear he's going to firmly support Israel, a large number of the Jewish billionaire and significant clout will withdraw the money.
You're already seeing this with Bill Ackman, who's now basically, I don't know if he said so explicitly or just is still alluding to the idea that he's going to vote for Trump. He's done a full right-wing turn. Yeah.
And Chaim Sabin, who's a very big money bags, Chaim Sabin in the Democratic Party, very close to the Clintons. And I don't think that's a trivial consideration. It's like, if you allow me to make the comparison, there were two aspects of the attacks on the college presidents during the demonstrations. There was the threats by the Jewish billionaire class to hold back the money, pull the money, and then there was that sideshow in Congress. The Congress sideshow was kind of a freak show. Anybody who watched it, it was just completely out to lunch. So I do not believe the principal pressure came from the lunatic right in Congress. The pressure came from the Jewish billionaire class, which said, if you don't stop these encampments, if you don't stop these demonstrations, and they also said it, as you know, to our mayor, our meaning New York, to Eric Adams. if you want to get Adams is in a lot of trouble because he's hopelessly corrupt and hopelessly incompetent. And they were signaling, no, it's true. And the Times is running all the stories on his corruption and incompetence. And the Jewish billionaire class said, if you don't stop these demonstrations, you're not getting our money. And then he did. You would not believe New York looked like for every demonstration. I'm not exaggerating. I tried to be very factual. It looked like an armed camp. I have never in my life seen so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cops for demonstrations which were just in the lower hundreds. For demonstrations which may have been 400 and 500, there were maybe 3 cops for every demonstration. And it's that pressure from the Jewish billionaire class or a section of that Jewish billionaire class. And I think that same pressure that they applied to Harvard and the same pressure they applied to U of P, the same pressures they applied to Columbia, the same pressures they applied to CUNY. Because liberal Jews are liberal, and it's maybe to a credit of Jews. I would say it's a credit. They like to give to cultural organizations, the Lincoln Center, Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you look at the list of contributors, it's 90% Jewish. Now they list the donors. Libraries, they love to give to libraries, and they like to give to universities. It's a fact. That's being Jewish. You support institutions of culture and the life of the mind if you have the money. And these folks have the money. That's the good side. But the bad side is it allows a lot of political pressure and a lot of clout. And if we call things by their real name, now I know the argument is it's all voluntary. They have the right to withdraw the money if they want. But it's blackmail. It's public blackmail. If you don't stop the demonstrations, we are going to pull the money. And it's the same thing with the Democratic Party. And Biden is concerned about that, to be the money being pulled, because as I said, it's kind of a truism of politics. Whichever side gets the most campaign contributions, almost invariably, there have been some exceptions, almost invariably wins the election in the fall.
Well, look, I know, Mouin, that you have to run, so I'm going to wrap us up here. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
for joining and listening to this kind of impromptu conversation. It is really, such an honor to be able to so casually dialogue with you both. And I agree with Last Chance here, who says it's good to have an opportunity to talk to you both in the same space without certain other parties who will go unnamed or who have been given many colorful names by Norm here, interrupting at every turn. It's really been great. So thank you both. I'm going to hang around after you leave just for a second to do a little housekeeping with the audience. But thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for a very productive evening.
Yes.
I learned a lot from Mouin.
I learned a lot from both of you.
No, yeah, I don't know. So I felt it was a very productive, substantive evening, and thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care to you both.
Bye.
All right, I'm just going to say quickly, thanks for all of you for hopping in here today. This wasn't supposed to happen here on the Bad Faith channel, but it is, a mitzvah of sorts to be able to host a beautiful conversation like this one. If you don't already subscribe to this channel, please do. You know how the algorithm is treating lefties and people who are covering not so popular mainstream issues like what's going on in Gaza. And if you're more interested in some of the legal nuances that we were discussing before, I did an interview with a law professor named Heidi Matthews that really took a fine comb to what's been going on with the ICC and explain some of these jurisdictional arguments in a way that I found to be really illuminating, even as someone who's been following it pretty closely. That was, I believe, last Thursday's free episode. Check out on Monday, I did an extended interview with Ben Norton, who really gave an extraordinary and encyclopedic level of detail about what's going on in Argentina with Javier Milei and why he is kind of exemplifying some of the failures of libertarianism as an ideology. And also stick around tomorrow on the free Thursday episode. it's a great guest, John Nichols, who is a veteran reporter at The Nation. We go through the mountains now of articles that have come out from Ezra Klein, Ian Chotiner, and this most recent one from Politico we recorded before it came out, but it's all in the same vein, which is that it's panic time for Joe Biden. These polls are terrible. And increasingly, it seems like everyone who's around him and who's advising him is telling him everything's okay. So much so that during the Ian Chotiner interview, the person being interviewed basically tried to rage quit the interview several times when he was simply asked basic questions about Biden's polls being so bad. The last thing I will mention is that I did 2 radars this week at Rising. I'm going back to 3 days a week instead of 4, which I was doing about a year ago. You might remember I was doing Tuesday through Thursdays. Now we're experimenting with me doing Mondays through Wednesdays. Hopefully it'll allow us all to take some of the pressure off of some intense conversations we've been having, and also give me more time to focus on Bad Faith podcast and work on some other different kinds of projects. But because I'm doing fewer days, I'm trying to put more into radars. So yesterday's radar was very popular, got a lot of eyes on it, and I'm very glad. I returned to the topic of the new round of attacks in Rafah for today's radar, and very specifically cobble together all of what I believe are the most important and revealing responses from John Kirby and Matt Miller, as they were really grilled really powerfully yesterday by so many journalists from across the ideological spectrum, in a way that I think really exposes, as we were talking about in the course of this conversation, really brutally exposes how empty Biden's promise of there being a red line are. I think it's really important to not just look at 1 or 2 of these clips, but to see them all as a body so you can see how flimsy the administration's arguments are and really feel empowered as we're making arguments against what the administration says is a reasonable process of kind of self administration and self-critique and holding oneself accountable as a country, Israel, in the ways that particular project is feeling. So go watch the radar, like and subscribe also to The Hill. At very least, I know it's frustrating sometimes listening to those conversations, but at very least, so you can catch my radars when I put them out. Tune in tomorrow for a free episode of Bad Faith, and subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month if you do want and you are able to. There are now hundreds of episodes, back episodes, premium episodes for you to look at. I mentioned this on a recent episode, but I keep listening to podcasts that I love, who keep mentioning that they have hit 300 episodes, 400 episodes after being on air for like 6, 7, 8 years. We're in year 3 of Bad Faith, and we're already well over 300 episodes. And it's because like this is a machine. You're getting 2 episodes every week without any breaks, no hiatus. I'm not trying to valorize not taking vacations and not taking breaks. But the reason that I don't is because I do think that this news is really important, and I feel overwhelmed when there are topics that kind of pass in the news cycle and I can't really get to them because it's only 2 episodes a week. So I really do appreciate your support, and I want to remind you that all of that content is out there. Thank you again for tuning in today. This was such an impromptu, joyful conversation to be able to have. And take care of yourselves and keep the faith.